The dawn sky was a ribbon of blood-red hope when Grace Collins rode into Downieville, California with hair stuffed beneath a worn slouch hat, and her curves bound tightly under layers of men's clothing that hung from her slender frame like sacks on a fence post. It was 1852, and the gold rush was in full swing, but the prosperity it promised had yet to touch her life. The mining camp turned settlement bustled with activity even at this early hour. Prospectors, storekeepers, and laborers moved through the dusty streets with purpose, none giving more than a passing glance to the slight, young man who guided a tired mare toward the livery stable. That was exactly how Grace wanted it, looking for work. The livery owner, a barrel-chested man with tobacco-stained teeth, appraised Grace as she dismounted. "Yes, sir." She kept her voice low the way she'd practiced for weeks. "Name's Grant Collins, handy with horses and willing to learn whatever else might need doing." The man scratched his beard. "Could use someone to muck stalls and tend horses when I'm busy with the smithing. Don't pay much, but there's a cot in the back room if you need a place." Grace nodded, relief washing through her, a job and shelter in one stroke of luck. After 6 months on the run, she'd learned that such fortune was rare. "Much obliged," she said, extending a hand wrapped in leather gloves that concealed delicate fingers. "I'll work hard, you've my word." "See that you do. I'm Sela's. Start by watering all the horses, then fill the feed troughs." "We'll see if you're worth keeping by sundown." Grace nodded, already moving to the task. Survival demanded immediacy. 6 months earlier, she'd been the pampered daughter of a successful merchant in St. Louis. 6 months earlier, her father had still been alive. 6 months earlier, she hadn't known that his business partner would claim both the business and her as payment for imagined debts. The day they buried her father, Mr. Blackburn had informed her of his intentions to collect on her father's obligations through marriage to Grace. She'd fled that night with only what she could carry, including her father's clothing and the money she could find in his study. The journey west had taught her quickly that a young woman traveling alone was prey. After narrowly escaping assault twice, she'd cut her hair, bound her chest, and disappeared into the identity of Grant Collins. Now in Downieville, she prayed she might finally find stability. The Sierra Nevada mining town was rough but prosperous, far from St. Louis and the reach of Blackburn. If she could maintain her disguise long enough to save money, perhaps she could eventually establish herself somewhere as a woman again, somewhere safe. As she filled water buckets, the livery door swung open. The silhouette of a tall man filled the doorframe, morning light creating a halo around his broad shoulders. "Sela's. That bay gelding ready." The voice was deep, commanding but not unkind. "Morning, Marshal. Just got in some new help. Your horse is ready to go." Grace kept her head down as the men conversed, focusing on her task. She felt the newcomer's eyes studying her but didn't dare look up. "New in town?" he asked, suddenly close enough that his shadow fell across her. She nodded, still not looking up. "Yes, sir, just arrived. Marshal Lane." "Town Marshal." He extended a hand. Reluctantly, Grace raised her eyes and shook his hand, keeping the grip firm but brief. "Grant Collins." Marshal Lane was tall and sun-bronzed, with eyes the color of the summer sky. A neatly trimmed mustache framed a mouth that seemed perpetually ready to smile. He wore a marshal's star pinned to a vest over a cotton shirt, with a gun belt riding low on his hips. "Welcome to Downieville, Collins. Stay out of trouble, and we'll get along fine." His eyes, too perceptive for Grace's comfort, lingered on her face for a moment before he turned to saddle his horse. "Yes, sir," she murmured, retreating to the water pump. As Grace worked through the morning, she considered her situation. The marshal had looked at her too long, too closely. Had he seen something in her face that betrayed her, she would need to be more careful. By midday, Sela's seemed pleased with her work. "You handle the animals well," he commented, watching as Grace calmed a fractious mare. "Where'd you learn horses?" "My father," she answered truthfully, "had a small stable back east." "He teach you smithing too?" Grace shook her head. "No, sir. But I'm willing to learn." Good, most young fellows come through here only want gold, won't dirty their hands with honest work. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers. Grace kept her interactions brief, her voice low, her movements deliberately lacking in feminine grace. By evening, her muscles ached from unaccustomed labor, but Silas hadn't sent her packing. "You eat yet, boy?" he asked as they closed up the stable. "No, sir." "Well, come on then. Wife always makes too much." Panic flickered through Grace. Dining with Silas meant close scrutiny from his wife, conversation, questions she might not be prepared to answer, but refusing might seem suspicious. "That's mighty kind," she said, "but I'm dead tired. Thought I might just turn in if that's all right." Silas shrugged. "Suit yourself." "Back room's through there. There's a wash basin and privy out back. Expect you at dawn." Once alone, Grace allowed herself a moment of relief. Her first day had passed without disaster. She filled the wash basin with cold water and, after ensuring the door was firmly latched, quickly unwound the bindings around her chest. The release of pressure made her gasp. Red marks scored her skin where the cloth had dug in. She washed carefully, keeping her undergarments on, too fearful of discovery to risk complete undress. After rebinding herself looser for sleep, she collapsed onto the narrow cot, exhaustion claiming her almost instantly. Dawn arrived too soon. Grace rose in darkness, tightened her bindings, and was already working when Silas arrived. The days established a pattern. Grace worked from dawn to dusk, learning smithing alongside stable management. She spoke little, laughed rarely, and avoided the saloons where most of Downieville's men spent their evenings. She began saving every penny, dreaming of the day she might have enough to start anew somewhere as herself. Marshal Lane appeared every few days, sometimes on business, sometimes seemingly without purpose beyond conversation with Silas. Each time, Grace felt his eyes on her, curious and assessing. Each time, she found reasons to be busy elsewhere in the stable. "Your new boy doesn't much care for me," he commented to Silas one afternoon, 3 weeks after Grace's arrival. "Collins, he's quiet with everyone, does his work, doesn't cause trouble." "Where'd you say he came from?" "Didn't. He's not much for talking about himself." Marshal nodded, thoughtful. "Lot of that going around these days. Men running from something." Grace, hidden in a stall where she'd retreated upon hearing the marshal's voice, felt cold fear trickle down her spine. Was he suspicious of her specifically, or just naturally wary as lawman? 2 months passed. Grace's hands grew calloused, her skin tanned from working in the open stable doors. She'd managed to avoid any situation that might expose her, carefully timing her bathing and personal care for moments of absolute privacy. The physical demands of the job had strengthened her, and she'd grown adept at the smithing tasks Silas entrusted to her. Early autumn brought a change to Downieville. The mining season was ending, and men were either departing with their fortunes or settling in for winter. The town grew rowdier as departing miners spent their earnings in one last hurrah. "Keep your head down these next few weeks," Silas warned Grace. "Troublemakers everywhere," she nodded, having already noticed the increasing frequency of brawls and drunken shouting in the streets. One evening, as Grace was closing up alone, Silas having gone to visit his brother in a neighboring settlement, the stable door creaked open. She turned, expecting a late customer, and froze. 3 men stood in the doorway, all visibly drunk. She recognized them as miners who'd struck it rich the previous week. "Need my horse," the foremost one slurred. "Heading out tonight." "The stable's closed, sir," Grace said, keeping her voice steady. "You can collect your horse in the morning." "Don't tell me when I can take my own property," the man growled, advancing into the stable. His companions followed, spreading out in a way that made Grace step back. "Your horse is fed and comfortable for the night," she tried again. "Traveling in darkness isn't safe. Look at this boy, thinking he can tell a man what to do," the second miner laughed. "Maybe we should teach him some respect." Grace's hand moved to the hammer hanging from her belt. "I don't want trouble. Please come back in the morning." The first miner lunged suddenly, grabbing Grace's arm with bruising force. My horse. Now. She twisted away, but the second man was already behind her. He caught her shoulders, shoving her against a post. Let me go. The fear made her voice rise, a feminine note creeping in. The men paused, exchanging glances. The first peered at her face more closely. Well now, he said slowly. That's interesting. Boys, I don't think this is a boy at all. Panic surged through Grace. The man reached for her hat, but she ducked, swinging the hammer. It connected with his arm, and he howled in pain. The second man caught her wrist, wrenching until the hammer clattered to the floor. The third man was circling around, blocking her escape to the door. Let's see what we've got here, the first miner said, nursing his arm but advancing again. Grace fought wildly, but they overpowered her easily. One pinned her arms while another grabbed her hat, pulling it off. Her hair, though short, fell free in a distinctly feminine style. Look at that, the miner crowed. A little lady playing dress-up. His hand moved toward the buttons of her shirt. Grace kicked out desperately, connecting with his knee. He cursed but didn't release her. Stop. The command cracked through the stable like a whip. All four froze, turning toward the door where Marshal Lane stood, his revolver drawn and pointed steadily at the miners. Let the boy go. Now, the miners hesitated. This ain't what you think, Marshal, the first one said. This ain't no boy, it's a girl dressed up like one. Marshal's expression didn't change. I said let go, step back, all of you. The authority in his voice compelled obedience. The miners released Grace, who stumbled away, desperately trying to replace her hat and compose herself. You three out. Your horses stay until morning. Be on the stage out of town by noon tomorrow, or I'll have you in cells for assault. But Marshal, now. The miners shuffled out, throwing dark looks at Grace as they passed. Marshal holstered his weapon only after they were well away, the sound of their boots fading down the street. Grace stood trembling, unable to meet his eyes. Her secret was exposed. Everything she'd worked for was crumbling. Collins, Marshal said quietly. She raised her chin, defiant despite her fear. Are you going to run me out of town too, Marshal? He studied her for a long moment. No. He stepped fully into the stable, closing the door behind him. But I think you'd better tell me who you really are and why you're pretending to be a man. Grace weighed her options. The marshal had just saved her from assault. He could have exposed her to the entire town, but hadn't. Perhaps truth was her only remaining choice. My name is Grace Collins, she began, her natural voice feeling strange after months of speaking in lower tones. I came from St. Louis after my father died. Marshal listened as she told her story, her father's death, Blackburn's unwanted advances and threats, her dangerous journey west, and the necessity that drove her to disguise. I didn't mean to deceive anyone, she finished. I just needed to survive. Marshal was silent for so long that Grace feared the worst. Finally, he spoke. You've broken no law that I'm aware of, Miss Collins. Women have dressed as men to fight in wars, to travel, to work. I can't say I approve of the deception, but I understand the necessity. Hope flickered in Grace's chest. You won't tell anyone, not my secret to tell, he paused. But those miners know, they might talk. Then I'll have to leave, Grace said, shoulders slumping. Start over somewhere else. Marshal shook his head, or you could stay and face it. Downieville has a few women running businesses of their own. Widow Morgan runs the bakery, Mrs. Peterson has the dressmaking shop. As a woman, I couldn't work in the livery, Grace pointed out. Sela's wouldn't keep me on. Perhaps not, Marshal conceded, but you'd no longer need to hide. Grace laughed bitterly. And then what? Be courted by every lonely miner? No, Marshal, I'd rather maintain my disguise as long as possible. He considered this. The miners who discovered you are leaving town. If you're careful, your secret could remain safe for now. Relief washed over her. You won't force me to reveal myself? No, but I'll be keeping an eye on you, Miss Collins. There was something in his voice, not threat, but promise. And I suggest you consider a more permanent solution than perpetual disguise. After the marshal left, Grace secured the stable with shaking hands. Her secret was no longer entirely her own, but Marshal Lane had chosen to protect it rather than expose her. Why? The question followed her into uneasy dreams. The next morning, Grace saw the three miners boarding the stage out of town, Marshal Lane watching from across the street to ensure their departure. When he caught her eye, he tipped his hat slightly before turning away. Days passed. Grace remained vigilant, expecting at any moment to hear whispers about her true identity, but none came. The miners had apparently kept her secret, perhaps fearing the marshal's retribution if they spread tales. Silas returned from his brother's place, and life at the livery continued as before. Except now, whenever Marshal Lane visited, Grace no longer avoided him. Their interactions remained brief, professional, but underpinned with shared knowledge. One evening, as Grace was shoeing a horse, a skill she'd recently mastered, Marshal appeared in the doorway. "Collins," he greeted. "Silas around?" Went home early. His knee was bothering him. She continued working, her movements precise. Marshal watched her for a moment. "You've gotten good at that." "Thank you, Marshal." She glanced up briefly. "Something I can help you with?" He hesitated, then stepped fully into the stable. "I've been thinking about your situation." Grace tensed. "Have you now?" "Yes, it occurs to me that while your current arrangement provides immediate safety, it's not sustainable long-term." She set down her tools, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm aware of that, Marshal, but my options are limited. Perhaps not as limited as you think." He leaned against a post. "There's a small property available on the edge of town. Previous owner struck gold and moved to San Francisco. It's got a small house and enough land for a modest horse breeding operation." Grace stared at him, confused. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you know horses. Because you've saved money these past months. Because it might offer you a way to transition back to living as yourself without losing your livelihood." "I couldn't run a horse business as a woman alone," Grace objected. "No one would sell to me or buy from me." "Not initially," Marshal agreed. "But with the right introduction, the right partner, it could work." Understanding dawned slowly. "Are you offering to help me?" "I'm offering a solution that could benefit us both. I've wanted to invest in a horse breeding operation for some time, but my duties as marshal don't allow me to manage it. You have the skills and could manage the day-to-day operations." "As partners?" Grace asked skeptically. "As partners. Publicly at first, then perhaps I'd sell my share to you once you've established yourself." The offer was unexpected, generous even, too generous. "Why would you do this, Marshal Lane?" He met her gaze steadily. "Because I admire your courage and determination. Because I believe people deserve second chances. And because I think you're wasting your talents mucking stalls when you could be building something of your own." Grace considered his words carefully. "I'd need time to think about it. Of course, the property isn't going anywhere." He straightened. "Just something to consider, Miss Collins." After he left, Grace sat on a bale of hay, mind whirling. The marshal's offer promised a path back to living as herself, a chance for a real life rather than a hidden existence. But it also meant trusting him completely, something she'd sworn never to do with any man again. That night, she lay awake long after the town quieted, weighing Marshal Lane's proposition against her fears. By morning, she'd made no decision, but questions had formed that only the marshal could answer. She found him at his office later that day. "May I speak with you privately, Marshal?" He looked up from his paperwork, surprise flickering across his features before he nodded. "Come in." "Close the door." Grace entered, removing her hat once the door was shut. It felt strange to acknowledge her femininity in his presence, even in this small way. "I've been thinking about your offer," she began, and I have questions. Why really are you helping me? What do you gain?" Marshall leaned back in his chair. "Direct questions deserve direct answers. I'm helping you because it's the right thing to do. What I gain is a business partnership with someone skilled with horses, and perhaps peace of mind knowing you're no longer in a precarious situation. That's all." Grace pressed. A slight smile touched his lips. "Well, there is the matter of your company, which I find I enjoy more than I should." The admission surprised her. Marshall, please. If we're to be business partners, formality seems unnecessary." "Marshall," she corrected. I can't offer you anything beyond business partnership. You understand that? I understand that's your position now, he said carefully. I make no demands or expectations beyond our business arrangement. The rest is possibility, nothing more. Grace considered this. The property, how much? They discussed finances, agreements, timelines. By the time Grace left the marshal's office, they had the outline of a plan. She would continue working for Silas through winter while they prepared the property. Come spring, Grant Collins would depart, and Grace Collins would arrive as Marshall Lane's business partner in a new horse breeding venture. The following months passed in a whirl of secret preparations. Grace continued her disguise at the livery, but evenings were often spent with Marshall, planning their business. She discovered in him a thoughtful intelligence, a quiet humor, and unwavering integrity. Despite her resolution to maintain emotional distance, she found herself looking forward to their meetings. For his part, Marshall kept his word, treating her with respect that never crossed into unwanted attention. He spoke to her as an equal, valued her opinions, and sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, watched her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. Winter in the Sierras was harsh. Snow isolated Downieville for weeks at a time, business at the livery slowed, and the saloons filled with miners waiting for spring. Grace was grateful for the steady work and shelter, though the cold seeped through the stable walls at night, making sleep difficult. One particularly bitter evening, as Grace was adding extra hay to the horse stalls for warmth, Marshall arrived stamping snow from his boots. Collins, he greeted, using her male name as always did in public. Didn't expect to find you still working. Animals need extra care in weather like this, she replied, continuing her task. He nodded, moving to help her. They worked in companionable silence for several minutes. You're shivering, he observed finally. It's cold, she said simply. Your room must be freezing tonight. Grace shrugged. I've managed worse, Marshall frowned. That won't do. There's a spare room at my place. It's yours if you want it, just for tonight. The offer was tempting. Her back room was indeed likely to be bitter cold, but people would talk. People always talk. Let them think I'm offering charity to a hard-working, stable hand. No one need know more. Grace hesitated, then nodded. Thank you. Later, following Marshall through snowy streets to his small house at the edge of town, Grace felt oddly vulnerable. This would be the first time she'd entered any man's home since fleeing St. Louis. Marshall's house was modest but comfortable, a sitting room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen, and 2 bedrooms off a short hallway. The fire was already burning, filling the space with welcoming warmth. Make yourself comfortable, he said, taking her coat. There's stew on the stove if you're hungry. Grace stood awkwardly, suddenly intensely aware of her disguise and the strangeness of their situation. I shouldn't stay long, nonsense. The storm's worsening, you'll stay the night as planned. His tone was matter-of-fact, leaving no room for argument. She ate the offered stew, which was surprisingly good, while Marshall told her stories about Downieville's early days. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, and gradually Grace relaxed. Do you miss it? Marshall asked suddenly. Miss what? Being yourself, living as Grace instead of Grant. The question caught her off guard. Sometimes, she admitted. I miss wearing a dress. I miss not binding myself so tightly I can barely breathe. I miss being seen. You are seen, he said quietly. Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them, acknowledgement, perhaps, of the growing connection neither had put into words. The spare room is through there, Marshall said finally, breaking the moment. There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up. Alone in the small bedroom, Grace unwound her bindings for the first time in days. The relief was immediate and she breathed deeply, massaging the red marks on her skin. She washed quickly, changed into the clean shirt Marshall had provided, and settled into the bed. The storm raged outside, but inside, warmth and safety enveloped her. She slept better than she had in months. Morning brought clear skies and brilliant sunshine that transformed the snow-covered town into a dazzling white expanse. Grace dressed carefully, restoring her disguise before joining Marshall for breakfast. "Sleep well?" he asked, setting coffee before her. "Better than I have in a long time," she admitted. "Thank you." Their eyes met, and Grace felt a now familiar flutter in her chest. Marshall smiled slightly, then turned to the stove. "We should finalize our plans today. The property will be ready soon." They spent the morning discussing details for their business venture. By noon, Grace needed to return to the livery. At the door, Marshall paused. "Spring isn't far off," he said. "Soon you won't need this disguise anymore." "I've almost forgotten what that feels like," she confessed, "living openly as a woman." "You'll remember," he assured her. His hand briefly touched hers. And Downieville will be lucky to have Grace Collins among its citizens. The weeks that followed brought increasing anticipation. The property Marshall had purchased was being prepared, fences mended, stable cleaned, house made habitable. They selected their first stock horses, arranged for their delivery, and planned the announcement of their business. As spring approached, Grace began preparing Silas for her departure. "Come April, I'll be moving on," she told him one evening. The old man frowned. "Thought you'd settled in here, boy." "I'm grateful for the opportunity you gave me," Grace said sincerely, "but I've saved enough to join a business venture." Silas grumbled but seemed to accept the news. "Well, you've learned good skills here, should serve you wherever you go." The day arrived when Grant Collins would leave Downieville and Grace Collins would emerge. Grace packed her few possessions and bid farewell to Silas, promising to visit. She rode to the edge of town where Marshall waited with a wagon to take her belongings to their new property. "Ready?" he asked as she approached. "As I'll ever be," Grace replied, nervousness evident in her voice. "The house is stocked with everything you'll need, including proper clothing," Marshall told her as they traveled. "Take a few days to settle in before we make your formal introduction to the town." The property was even more appealing in person than Grace had imagined, a modest but sound house surrounded by good grazing land, with a newly repaired stable that could hold up to 10 horses. Inside the house, Grace found dresses, undergarments, and personal items appropriate for a young businesswoman. "How did you manage all this?" she asked, running her fingers over a blue calico dress. "Mrs. Peterson helped," Marshall admitted. "She believes you're my cousin, coming to help with the business after recovering from illness back east. And she didn't question why your cousin might need an entirely new wardrobe. She's a practical woman with a flair for business. I paid well and she asked minimal questions." Grace smiled, then sobered. "I'm afraid, Marshall, what if people don't accept me? What if someone recognizes me as Grant?" "They might," he acknowledged. "But Downieville has its share of unusual stories. Yours will be just one more. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "my position carries some influence. Anyone giving you trouble will answer to me." Over the next few days, Grace reacquainted herself with femininity. She let her hair, which had grown considerably, fall naturally, practiced walking without the deliberately masculine stride she'd adopted, and grew accustomed to dresses again. The release from bindings and disguise was physically liberating, though emotionally she felt exposed, vulnerable. Marshall visited daily, bringing supplies, news, and quiet encouragement. He never pushed for more than she offered, respecting the boundaries she'd established, yet Grace could feel something growing between them, something neither had acknowledged. A week after her arrival, Marshall brought a visitor, Widow Morgan, from the bakery. "Mrs. Morgan, may I present my business partner, Miss Grace Collins," he said formally. The older woman appraised Grace with shrewd eyes. "Marshall Lane speaks highly of your knowledge of horses, Miss Collins." "I was raised around them," Grace replied, keeping her voice steady in its natural register. "My father bred horses in Missouri before his passing." They took tea together, the conversation gradually warming as Mrs. Morgan's initial reserve melted. By the time she left, Grace had been invited to join the Small Ladies' Aid Society that met weekly at the bakery. "That went well," Marshall observed after seeing Mrs. Morgan out. "She's kind," Grace said. "I wasn't expecting that." Downieville has its share of good people. He hesitated. Are you ready to attend church this Sunday? It would be the most efficient way to introduce you to everyone at once. The thought sent anxiety coursing through Grace, but she nodded. Yes, it's time. Sunday arrived bright and clear. Grace, dressed carefully in the blue calico, arranged her hair in a simple but feminine style and tried to calm her racing heart as Marshall's wagon approached. He helped her up beside him, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. You look beautiful, he said quietly. Grace blushed, unused to such compliments after so many months of disguise. Thank you. The church service passed in a blur. Grace was aware of curious glances, whispered conversations, and open stares. Marshall stayed beside her, a steady presence that helped calm her nerves. Afterward, he introduced her to what seemed like the entire town. Most were welcoming, though Grace detected suspicion from some, particularly among the women who clearly viewed any new female as potential competition for the town's limited supply of eligible men. Marshall Lane's business partner, you say? One woman repeated, skepticism evident. How unusual. Miss Collins brings expertise we need, Marshall responded smoothly. Her father was renowned for his breeding stock in Missouri. By the time they returned to the property, Grace was exhausted but relieved. I survived, she said, accepting Marshall's hand as he helped her down. You did more than survive, he corrected. You impressed quite a few people, including Judge Wilson, who's looking for a new mount. Spring progressed into summer. The horse breeding business began modestly but steadily. Marshall's reputation brought customers, and Grace's genuine skill with the animals kept them coming back. They settled into a comfortable routine, Grace managing the day-to-day operations, while Marshall handled legal matters, and divided his time between the marshal's office and the breeding farm. Gradually, Grace established herself in Downieville society. She joined the Ladies' Aid Society, attended church regularly, and developed friendships, particularly with Mrs. Morgan and the young wife of the bank manager. Few connected her with the quiet, stable hand who had left town, and those who might have seen the resemblance kept their suspicions to themselves. The partnership with Marshall remained professional in public, though their private moments carried increasing tension. Grace caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes filled with something more than business interest. For her part, she found herself noticing details about him, the way sunlight caught in his hair, how his smile appeared more readily around her, the gentleness of his hands when they worked together with the horses. One evening, as they sat on the porch reviewing accounts, a comfortable silence fell between them. The summer twilight painted the landscape in soft golds and purples, while crickets began their nightly chorus. I received a letter today, Marshall said finally, from St. Louis. Grace's head jerked up. What? From whom? The inquiry I made regarding your former situation. It seems Mr. Blackburn has suffered significant business reversals. His creditors have claimed most of his assets. Relief flooded through Grace. So he's no longer looking for me. It appears he has more pressing concerns now, Marshall confirmed. You're safe, Grace, truly safe. The knowledge settled over her like a warm blanket. For the first time since her father's death, the shadow of pursuit no longer loomed over her. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. For protecting me, for giving me a chance at a real life again. Marshall set aside the account book. Grace, he began, then hesitated. There's something I've wanted to say for some time now, her heart quickened. Yes. When I first discovered your secret, I helped you because it was right. When I offered partnership, I did so because I saw your potential, but now, he took a deep breath. Now I find myself hoping for something more between us. The admission hung in the air between them. Grace had known this moment was coming, had felt it building for months. Part of her had dreaded it, fearful of vulnerability. Another part had longed for it. Marshall, she paused, gathering her thoughts. When I came west, I swore I'd never depend on any man again. I needed to prove I could survive on my own. His expression fell slightly, but he nodded. I understand. But she continued, reaching for his hand, I've learned there's a difference between dependence and partnership. What we've built here, it's equal. We rely on each other's strengths. Hope flickered in his eyes. And I find myself thinking of you as more than a business partner too. The admission made her feel both vulnerable and liberated. But I'm afraid. I've spent so long hiding, protecting myself. Marshal's hand tightened around hers. I would never ask you to be anything other than exactly who you are, Grace, strong, determined, occasionally stubborn. His smile was tender. I admired Grant Collins' courage, but I've fallen in love with Grace. The declaration stole her breath. Love? Yes, he said simply. Love. I love your strength, your resilience, your kindness with the animals, your determination to build something meaningful. I love watching you become more yourself every day. Tears pricked at Grace's eyes. I think I've been falling in love with you too, she whispered, even when I tried not to. Marshal's free hand rose to cup her cheek. May I kiss you, Grace Collins? Her answer was to lean forward, meeting his lips with hers in a gentle kiss that quickly deepened. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing rapidly. Well, Marshal said, a smile breaking across his face. That was worth waiting for, Grace laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. Indeed it was, Marshal Lane. Their courtship progressed with the same care and respect that had characterized their business relationship. Marshal was patient, never pushing Grace beyond her comfort. For her part, Grace gradually lowered the defenses she'd built, allowing herself to trust and love openly. The business thrived as their relationship deepened. By autumn, they had established Collins and Lane horse breeders as one of the most respected operations in the region, with customers coming from as far as Sacramento. On a crisp October evening, Marshal proposed properly, kneeling before her with a simple gold ring. I want to build a life with you, Grace, not just a business. Will you marry me? Tears blurred her vision as she nodded. Yes, yes, I will. They married in Downieville's church 2 weeks before Christmas with the entire town in attendance. Grace wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Peterson had labored over for weeks. Marshal looked handsome in a new black suit, his eyes never leaving Grace throughout the ceremony. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister declared, and Marshal kissed her to the applause of their friends and neighbors. The reception at their farm lasted well into the evening. When the last guest had departed, Marshal carried Grace across the threshold of what was now truly their home. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Grace traced the lines of her husband's face with gentle fingers. Are you happy? He asked softly. Happier than I ever thought possible, she answered truthfully. When I fled St. Louis, I thought only of survival. I never imagined I'd find this a home, a successful business, a husband who knows me completely. I knew from the first moment I saw you in Silas's stable that there was something different about you, Marshal confessed. I couldn't have guessed your secret then, but I felt drawn to you even as Grant Collins. Grace smiled in the darkness. And here I thought I was being so convincing. You were convincing enough, he assured her, pulling her closer. But there was a gentleness beneath your careful mannerisms that intrigued me. When did you first suspect the truth? Marshal considered this. I had suspicions before the incident with the miners. Small things, the way you avoided certain situations, how your voice sometimes slipped when you were tired. But I wasn't certain until that night. And you chose to protect me. I chose to protect a person in need, he corrected gently, that it was you only made the choice easier. Grace nestled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I never thought I'd be grateful for having to disguise myself as a man, but without that disguise, I might never have met you. Life has strange ways of bringing people together, Marshal agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I'm just thankful it brought you to me, Grace Lane. The new name, her married name, filled her with quiet joy. Grace Lane, she repeated, I like the sound of that. Spring brought new foals to their breeding farm, new growth to their business, and news that left Grace both terrified and elated. She was expecting their first child. A baby. Marshal's face transformed with wonder when she told him. We're having a baby. In late autumn, the doctor thinks, Grace confirmed, hands protectively covering her still flat stomach. Are you pleased? His answer was to sweep her into a gentle embrace. Pleased doesn't begin to describe it. I'm overjoyed, Grace, absolutely overjoyed. As her body changed with the pregnancy, Grace found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The young woman who had fled St. Louis in terror would hardly recognize the life she now lived: respected business owner, beloved wife, expectant mother. The disguise that had once been necessary for survival had given way to a life more authentic and fulfilling than she could have imagined. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Marshal's hand resting protectively over her growing belly, Grace shared these thoughts. I was so afraid for so long, she said. First of Blackburn, then of discovery, then of trusting again, but fear would have kept me from this happiness. Marshal nodded thoughtfully. Fear keeps us alive in dangerous times, but courage lets us truly live once those times have passed. You gave me the courage, Grace told him, turning to meet his eyes. By protecting my secret, by offering partnership, by loving me as I am. You always had courage, Grace, he countered. You left everything behind and crossed half a continent alone. You created a new identity to survive. You built this business alongside me. His hand caressed her cheek. I merely recognized the strength that was already there. Their son, James Michael Lane, was born on a clear November night with Mrs. Morgan assisting the doctor. The moment Grace held him in her arms, tears of joy streaming down her face, she knew that every hardship had been worthwhile to reach this point. Marshal wept unashamedly when he first held his son. He's perfect, he whispered, awe filling his voice. Absolutely perfect. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. Collins and Lane horse breeders became the premier breeding operation in Northern California. They expanded their property, built a larger home, and welcomed a daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, 2 years after James. Grace never forgot her time as Grant Collins. Indeed, the experience informed many of her business decisions and gave her unique insight into how men perceived and often underestimated women. She used this knowledge to her advantage, establishing herself as a shrewd businesswoman whose opinion was sought and respected throughout the region. Marshal continued as Downieville's marshal for several more years before retiring to focus exclusively on their breeding operation. His fairness and integrity had made him beloved in the community, and many tried to persuade him to run for mayor, though he always declined, preferring to work alongside Grace, building their legacy. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they watched their children playing in the meadow behind their home, Marshal wrapped his arm around Grace's waist. Any regrets? He asked. Grace shook her head, leaning into his embrace. Not one. Every step, even the difficult ones, led me here. Even disguising yourself as a man, he teased. Especially that, she replied with a smile. It taught me strength I didn't know I had, brought me to Downieville and ultimately to you. She turned in his arms to face him. And you, Marshal Lane. Any regrets about marrying the woman who once mucked stalls in your town? His eyes, still as blue and clear as the day they'd met, held hers with unwavering love. Only that I didn't discover your secret sooner, so I might have had even more time to love you. As the sun set behind the Sierra Nevada mountains, painting the sky in brilliant reds and golds, Grace stood secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be, no longer hiding, no longer afraid, but fully herself in the arms of the man who had protected her secret and won her heart. The disguise that had once been necessary for survival had given her the chance to discover her true strength. And Marshal, in protecting her secret, had shown her that love doesn't demand disguises, it embraces truth, even when that truth comes wrapped in men's clothing with a story that defies convention. Together they had built something remarkable: a thriving business, a loving family, and a partnership founded on mutual respect and deep affection. What had begun as a desperate measure for survival had transformed into a love story that would be told in Downieville for generations to come. I love you, Marshal Lane, Grace whispered as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. And I love you, Grace Lane, he replied, sealing the words with a kiss that held the promise of all the years still to come. Always have, from the moment I saw past the disguise to the extraordinary woman beneath.